Hi, grade sixes. So this video is part of our social studies lessons for this week. This is the second part for the day. So the first part, you had 3 questions to answer on that worksheet. And now your task is to watch this video where I'm talking, and then you are to write down 5 things that are either interesting or you hadn't learned yet in any of our readings. Because this will help with our kind of final assignment that's going to happen next week. So the reason I'm making this video and talking is that in the past, when we've done this unit with the grade sixes, obviously we're in the classroom and we have a PowerPoint that looks like this, and the kids write things down, which we didn't really want to do this time because it's just a bit hard to explain what we mean in the PowerPoint when we're not face to face. So I'm just going to do some talking, and I'm just going to read through some of the information that we haven't shared with you yet. And your job is to write down 5 things that are interesting, new, or you haven't learned yet in any of the readings. Okay, so we're going back to when the Chinese settlers first came to Canada, when they immigrated from China. So the year is 1858. And Chinese settlers came to work in British Columbia in the mines. Okay, and then we've got a little picture here of some Chinese immigrants working in the mines. By 1880, thousands of Chinese workers came to help build the Canadian Pacific Railway, or the CPR, and that was going to connect British Columbia with the rest of Canada. So it was a big job, and they needed lots of people to help build that. On the railways, Chinese workers had to pay for food, for clothing. If they wanted to mail something back home, they had to pay for that. If they needed any medical care, like they hurt themselves or they were sick, they had to pay for that. Unlike Canadian or European workers. So Canadian, European workers didn't have to pay for that sort of stuff, but Chinese immigrants did. And this meant that they had very little money to send home because lots of them had a family back home in China. And since they had to pay for all this stuff, it was hard for them to send money home. They were also given jobs that seemed too dangerous for other people to do, such as blasting tunnels through rocks with explosives. Many Chinese immigrants died while working on the railway, and the deaths were not recorded, and they weren't told to their families back home. So you can imagine there are wives and children back home in China whose uncles, fathers, brothers didn't come home, and perhaps families weren't aware if they were alive or not because they weren't told. So in 1885, when the CPR was finished, the Prime Minister at the time, his name was John A. Macdonald, said that Chinese people should be excluded from Canada. So that means not included. And he created the Chinese Immigration Act. The act said that all Chinese people had to pay a fee to be allowed to come into Canada. So every Chinese person applying to come into Canada had to pay $50. Then it was eventually raised to $100, and then later it was raised to $500. So the Canadian government, by 1923, had collected $23 million in fees from Chinese immigrants, and that's equivalent to about $1 billion today. It's a lot of money. So the fee was made because the Canadian government assumed that this fee is too much, the Chinese people won't be able to pay for it, and then they won't come. So the tax worked for a while because it did prevent lots of Chinese people from coming to Canada. The number of Chinese newcomers dropped from 8,000 in 1882 to 124 in 1887. However, more started coming the next decade, and that's why Ottawa raised the tax to $500 in 1903. And $500 was more than a year's wage for the average worker. After World War I, the economy slowed down and it was harder to find a job. Many Canadians blamed the Chinese people for taking jobs away from white people. In 1923, Canada passed another Chinese Immigration Act, which stopped Chinese immigration altogether. So there wasn't even a fee. They just couldn't come. Chinese people already living in Canada had to register with the government, or they could be deported. They were allowed to go home to China for visits and then re-enter Canada, but no new immigrants could come in. So this meant that Chinese men already living here couldn't bring their families or their wives or their kids because the law was made now that if you're here, you can stay, but nobody new can come in. So during all of this, European immigrants, so immigrants from countries in Europe, were treated very differently. They didn't have to pay any fees or taxes to be able to come into Canada. They were actually given incentives to come into Canada. So an incentive is like something that makes you want to come, such as big tracts of land for development. Anti-Chinese people saw that Chinese immigrants came here without families and they thought that they lived simply. So they thought the Chinese men coming here didn't need money because they didn't have families to raise. But they actually had families back home. You just couldn't see them because they didn't come to Canada with them. They argued that the Chinese could work for lower wages and could take jobs away from the Canadian workers. British Columbians also firmly believed that their way of life was better. Many saw China as a weak nation. They were backwards people who could never learn to live like Canadians. And many people also believed that Chinese people carried diseases. So that's everything for this video. You can pause, rewind if you need to, but just make sure you write down 5 things. 5 things that you feel are important, new, or interesting, and this will help you with a final assignment that we will get started on next week. Thank you.